Hello and good morning, everyone. We're just about ready for the second round of talks of the morning, and it is my genuine pleasure to introduce to you a person that works on something that's quite near and dear to my heart, documentation. Please welcome to the stage Alexandra White, who works for Google Chrome.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Technically Speaking, Improve Your Code with Documentation. From the bottom of my heart, I am so thrilled to be here with all of you. Before we get to the good stuff, I'm going to tell you why I'm here, why as a technical writer at this conference. I'll discuss and define what technical writing is and the kind of documentation that developers should be creating. I'll set those expectations, and I'll talk about the keys to good writing, which is knowing your audience. That's the technical writer secret. We'll then discuss optimizing the deliverables, what kind of writing you should be doing. We'll review why any of this matters. So what? Why do you care? And then I'll leave you with 6 final takeaways. And this talk is less than 30 minutes. You know, we can't do it all. I just want to be honest right up front. My goal is to get you inspired to be writing more documentation, leave you with some practical takeaways, but there's more work to be done, more we could discuss. Let's talk about it. Ask questions. I think at 12:10 p.m., ask me questions or talk to me offline. Hi. Again, my name is Alexandra White, and I am a technical writer for Google Chrome and the Privacy Sandbox. Before I was a technical writer, I was a web developer, and I worked at a television station where the engineers I worked with had been there for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years. And we were supporting websites built in as far back as 1998, built by the engineer who had been there for 20 years. So anytime I needed to make an update, I had to say, hey, Brian, where's that website? Is there anything I need to know? Anything? Please tell me what I need to know. The knowledge of all of the ways our systems work were totally locked inside of their heads, which is totally unsustainable. Like, what if we were all on a plane and got in a plane crash? That's a little dramatic, but you know, it's important to have documentation. I made it my mission to get as much out of their heads and onto a page as possible. So I did what any millennial would do. I started a technical blog. That's what we do, I think. This was sold to them as a way to become online technical experts, to sort of build our brand as web developers, because we built websites for our television station, but also for companies all over New York City, where the station was based. I also tried to instill other best practices, create other kinds of documentation. Turns out a technical blog is not enough to get all of the backlog of 20 years into docs. Now I'm in my 3rd full-time position as a technical writer, but I still believe that developers should be heavily involved in the documentation process. Documentation is your tool for success. It's how you build your future self, your colleagues, create a better environment for all of the other developers around you. And there are software engineers that I work with, there are developers I work with who say, I don't do words, you do words. I do code, you are over here, I am over here. But I have really good news for all of you. You're already a writer. Congratulations, you've won. That doesn't mean that you're writing prose or beautiful plays like Shakespeare or a novel series, but you are already writing. You're definitely already writing for work. You're probably writing emails about where to go for lunch. You might be tweeting. There are a number of ways in which you're putting pen to paper, fingers to keyboard, and creating words. So you're probably wondering what kind of writing is actually needed for you to do your work. And like I said, I've yet to meet someone who doesn't write any documentation at all or writes no code comments. This is just an opportunity to write more, to write better. Let me be clear, I also think that any large company, any company who has the capacity should hire technical writers. Developers are not the same as technical writers. It's the kind of documentation work that a technical writer does, it's complicated. I probably write 20% of my day, maybe 15%. The rest of the time, I'm going to my subject matter experts, I'm talking to the product team, I'm talking to the developers, trying to get, again, that information out of your heads and onto the page, advocating for our users. Ultimately, the kind of technical writing, the kind of documentation that developers should do is a little different, but really absolutely essential. So let's talk about what that looks like, what good docs look like. But we're going to start with what good docs are not. Once again, good documentation, not Hamlet. I've been using this example for a long time. It's wild to be in Denmark, where, Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, is from. Good documentation isn't paragraph after paragraph of long, flowery language. Good documentation should be understood by your audience. When I was in school, I used Cliff's Notes to understand what Shakespeare was trying to say. And if you're unfamiliar, Cliff's Notes provided a modern translation of Shakespeare's words. I would read all of the monologues, the sonnets, and think, I don't know what that means. What is this? So Cliff's Notes was a way to help me get some contextual information. If you're familiar with Hamlet, and I'm sure many of you are, then perhaps you'd recognize the soliloquy from the modern translation, which I wrote, so forgive me. Life or death, existence. Is it better to live and suffer, or should I take action to stop existing? Super moody. That's to be or not to be, that's the real soliloquy. The real flowery prose that Shakespeare wrote, not documentation. Let's leave the beautiful metaphors and allegories to the marketing writers and the journalists and all of those creative writing geniuses. Translation alone, however, doesn't actually mean documentation. Writing documentation isn't saying, this is exactly what's on the page, here's what you're seeing. It's giving added context. Technical writing is clear, concise, conscientious commentary. It's added value to your work. Your job is to fully understand the products and the features that you build and support. By writing this information down as documentation, you are more likely to understand the work that you've done and be able to teach someone else how to do it. And while grammar, style, it's important, okay? It is a little important, but it's the least important thing on your list. Don't worry about spelling. Worry about getting the information clearly onto the page. I think of learning as a two-step process. The first step is absorption of information. That's when you read documents, watch videos, listen to podcasts, all of the things that intake information. The second part is teaching, re-expressing that information by either writing it down or telling it to somebody else. This theory, the flipped classroom, is created by Eric Mazur from Harvard University. He calls it the best method for learning, and I tend to agree. I became a better developer by explaining how my code worked. Documentation should not just be sprinkled on top at the end. Sprinkles, wonderful, colorful crunch, love it on my ice cream, but it's the last thing that happens. Documentation should be integrated throughout your work. In the US, there's a very popular birthday cake, confetti cake, or there's a box mix called funfetti. Love it so much. It's very popular, and what makes it so exciting is all of the sprinkles that are woven throughout the vanilla cake. Everybody likes to cut into the cake and see sprinkles inside. Treat your documentation and the documentation process like confetti cake. Integrate documentation throughout your work. Now, we all agree docs are important. We all have decided that. I can see your happy, shiny faces. Thank you very much. Now you get to know the real secret to writing good docs. It's the #1 answer in any technical writing interview. What do you have to do first? You have to know who your audience is. The first audience to consider is also the easiest when you're creating any kind of documentation, and that's past you. Why past you? Why not current you? You're writing documentation to help the version of you who was creating the project or creating the feature. The best way to understand it is to re-articulate what you've learned. Writing documentation fills in the gaps between what you thought you were going to build and what you ended up building. So it's possible you wrote a design document in advance. Writing documentation replaces the things that you didn't necessarily complete the way you thought that you would. And how many times have you worked on a project and somebody has asked you years later, hey, can you go back and work on that? Like I mentioned, I was working on websites from 1998, and the developer who had built it had to remember where the code was. Often he didn't. Back when I was, again, a developer, I built a bingo plugin. And I put it on GitHub, and I thought, that's open source. I know what open source means. I put my code out there, and now people can use it. Reader, she did not know what open source meant. But in 2019, 2 different groups emailed me and said, hey, we want to be able to use this bingo application. Can you update it, though, or provide us some documentation? Because there's none of that. And I thought, oh, no, it's been 5 years. I don't know how I did this. What is this? Past me didn't know that future me would be a technical writer and admonish herself. So if I had written documentation, I really would have saved myself the self-flagellation. I would have saved myself from the pain of having to, again, look back and think, what was any of this? As I tried to solve the broken code and also figure out how I could provide the best content for them to get their bingo plugin up and running. And there are those of you who aren't lone developers, those who work on a team. Writing documentation supports your colleagues. It helps answer questions that they might have while you are out speaking at a conference, for example, or when you're reassigned to new work, or when you leave your job, as some of us do, and move on to something bigger and better. I'm very lucky to have a lot of colleagues I can call upon for support. And so I want to encourage all of you to write all of that internal documentation. That's often the stuff that's the most neglected. The support that happens from technical writers and from companies often goes to external users, because that's where the money is, right? Like, we need to support our users to use our product, so they buy our product, et cetera, et cetera. And there are times when there isn't a technical writer, and you are responsible for writing documentation. So there's another little secret I want to let you in on. Knowing who your audience is critical to the kind of documentation that you create. It's true that sometimes multiple audiences need the same thing. My internal stakeholders care about a lot of the same things that my external users care about. For the most part, people who do not work at your company won't know as much as you do, right? Makes sense. You gain knowledge over time, you slowly become more of an expert, and you forget what you know that you didn't know before. And it's hard to put yourself in the position of a new engineer to the team, or the position of a user who may be totally new to your product. This is called the curse of knowledge. Really fun name. I like it a lot. The curse of knowledge means that you are cursed with knowing and not knowing what you didn't know before. kind of a mouthful to explain. When writing your documentation, ask yourself the question, can I expect my reader to know what this means? If there's an acronym, write out the whole word. What else should you tell them? Here are some, best practices. It's important that you optimize the deliverables that they'll need. So, for example, curse of knowledge, if you are exposing them to a lot of terms that they don't know, include a glossary. Just add that at the beginning, link it out. You don't necessarily want to keep repeating yourself, but there are a number of other types of documentation that you can create. The best time to write docs is to write while you're building your project, write while you code. You understand your project best when you are actively building it. And the easiest way to do that is to write code comments, those bits of human-friendly information that exist and that the machine doesn't care about. One of the products I used to cover, it's called Google Publisher Tag. If you ran a website that hosted ads, you needed the one line of JavaScript, GBT, to put ads on your website, but the secret was most of the people putting this code on their website weren't developers. They worked in the Ad Manager UI and had limited technical understanding. Comments shouldn't be explaining what functions do. The code should explain itself, right? So in this example, there's a function called define slot. And if you're in the ads world, you know that this means define an ad slot. Writing a comment that says create ad slot isn't particularly helpful. I really like this example because, like I said, the people embedding this code often are not the people who are the most technically minded, who don't necessarily understand. So here is the very specific comment that we include in that code sample. Specify the network, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the targeted ad unit, travel Asia. Indicate multiple sizes with the syntax, width 1, height 1. And here's the money piece of this comment. For multi-slice ad slots, declare slot sizes in the same order as in the Ad Manager UI. What does that mean? It means that you have to write the sizes of the ads in the order that you input it in the UI. If you don't, it doesn't work. Should the code still work if they're not in order? It should, but I don't work on that team anymore. After coding, after you're done with your project, write a README to give a summary of your project. It tells the developers where to start. READMEs, of course, especially important when you're open sourcing, but they're important internally too. What I would have given for more READMEs of projects when I was a junior developer. Anything. My leg, my left leg, for a README. What makes a good README? Project title, of course, we know that. Project description, 1 to 2 sentences, what is this? Also, prerequisites and configuration. You'd be surprised at the number of times, well, actually you probably wouldn't be surprised at the number of times you come across something and then you realize, oh, I needed to have a package installed. Oh, I needed to be able to know to use this language. All of those things, remember again, your audience doesn't know what's in your head. Curse of knowledge, be sure to get it out on the page. I think that people will forgive you for over-explaining, but they won't forgive you for under-explaining. Make sure to include installation instructions, instructions on how to use the project, if you want people to be able to contribute, guidance, or a link to a longer document that says how one could contribute, contact information if you want people to find you, or none if you don't. And again, if it's open source, please include a license. It's important also to write step-by-step instructions. I think often when people think about documentation, they might think of this or API reference documentation. And it can be great to include images, GIFs, screencasts, but don't forget to include words. Think about accessibility. There always needs to be written documentation. So here's some example of some bad instructions. Fry potatoes, eat potato pancake. I'm guessing this is instructions to make a potato pancake. There are a lot of ways we can improve this. Let's look at a different version. The thing to note here is that we list the ingredients, we list the tools, and then we list 9 thorough instructions. And I include recipes as an example because often this is where people, again, non-technical folks, fail. I have a friend who does not know how to cook. Bless her, she tries so hard, and if there is a single step missing in the recipe, you don't know what you're gonna get. So think about who your audience is. If I was writing for her, this might have 20 steps. But I'm thinking that my audience is comfortable in the kitchen. They know how to cook, so this should be sufficient. Writing documentation from scratch, really hard, really, really hard. I highly recommend that you get started with templates. If you have a technical writer who you work with, ask them. They will be thrilled to help you with this. And if not, I have some templates, which I will share in a link at the end. One piece of writing you might already do, or someone on your team does, is release notes. A release note can be anything from, hey, we have a new release, to specific details about changes. The most important function of release notes is to let your user know what's changing, what's going away, what's new. That way they can make the appropriate decisions of what to do next, such as download the update or not download the update. Let's talk about this terrible release note that we've all seen 1,000 times. Bug fixes, performance improvement. If you have a phone, you've seen this, a smartphone, I should say, you've seen this 1,000 times. And sometimes a lawyer will come to you and say, we are not allowed to say what changed. No, that is secret information, so this is all you get to say. In that case, fine. Fine, you've said something. Something is better than nothing. But please be more specific. Release notes are definitely subjective. There are people who want them to be kind of funny and cute, but don't ever sacrifice information for being funny. Make sure that your release notes are informative. They tell the user what they need to know. Remember to be human, like your reader probably is. Who's to say? And balance your creativity with the facts. Then there are blog posts. Remember me, a girl who thought documentation, technical blog, the answer to all of our problems. I still believe that blog posts are a really great way to help introduce people to new subjects. I still rely on other people's blog posts to learn about new technology. And my team writes blog posts on web.dev. What makes a good blog post? You're asking and then you're answering questions, such as, why should the reader care about this content? Who are you? How do they know to trust you with giving them this information? What do you want your reader to get out of it? Is it understanding a really complicated concept, or is it knowing how, step by step, how to accomplish something? When does the reader need to know this information? Is it time sensitive? Okay, so what? Why does any of this matter? Knowledge is power. If there's one thing I can leave you with, knowledge is power. If you say, this doesn't need documentation, you are speaking from a position of privilege. Just the existence of documentation opens up a product and a project to underserved and underrepresented groups of people. It's 2022. There is no reason not to be inclusive. 100% of developers who write documentation are better developers. This is a definitely real statistic that I did not make up for this talk. I promise. It's real. There's a lot of research out there on this, actually. I promise. And I know that your time is precious, so I'm going to take a moment to speak to anybody who's a manager in the room, who's in leadership. I'm asking of you to consider documentation as a part of the expectations for developers. And maybe if you're a developer, you didn't actually want to hear me say that, but it's really important. It's an important part of your job. And if it's not considered a valuable part of your time, it won't get done. And I understand that. Time is money. Money is power. Power is pizza. I hope that you agree with me that writing is really important. You're all going to leave this and say, I'm going to write all the docs now. Here are 6 final takeaways for you so that you can write those docs better. Tip 1, be concise. You know who wasn't concise? Shakespeare. Loved to talk, loved to use beautiful words, but don't be Shakespeare. Write documentation, be clear, be concise. If there was a zombie apocalypse happening, you wouldn't over-explain what zombies are, right? You would say, run, take cover, zombies. Tip 2, dump it out of your brain. Have a brain dump. Get all of the information out of your head and onto a page, and then you can organize it later. It's more important to get the information out and then worry about being thorough. Organize it. Make sure to add headers. Use lists. Use all of the tools to make your document more concise. Know your audience. I spent a lot of time on this. The easiest way, the easiest person to start with is yourself, but again, think about your past self. Think about what you didn't know before you started building something and write for that person. Tip 5, ask for feedback. You wouldn't share your code without testing it, right? We don't do that. No, we definitely don't do that. Similar to any user experience process, make sure to have your colleagues look at it if they have a moment. Tell you if something is missing. And finally, if there's one takeaway that you take, if you ignore everything else, the #1 tip I have for you is to write documentation while you're writing your code. It's going to make it 1,000 times easier to be able to get documentation done. Remember, write like a piece of confetti cake, integrate your documentation throughout the process of building your project. And at the end, you'll have something delicious, clear, concise, and understandable. Thank you.